I'm Danielle Smith with the Alberta Enterprise Group. I'm collaborating with Common Sense Edmonton to interview candidates for the upcoming municipal race for Edmonton City Council. And joining me now is Mark Davies. He's the candidate in what is numbered Ward 2, but we're moving to a different name. And he's going to tell us what that is now. Mark, tell us the ward that you're running for.
It's called Ward Anirniq.
And what does that mean?
It means breath of life. And actually, there's actually a really informative video. Actually, the Journal did it. CBC Edmonton has done it. So if you're looking for like a quick little 2-minute montage hit on kind of the history of the video or of the ward, they're very informative and they're well produced. So
excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Definitely will. So tell us, why is it that you've decided to put your name forward for council now?
Well, first of all, I want to, before we get the interview going, Danielle, I want to say to all the millions of listeners out there, our viewers, we're trying to get you that big Spotify contract. So by all means, share, like, and do everything you can on social media because we need to get to that next platform, right?
Oh, I like that. Thank you. We're going to talk about technology because I know you're a big tech guy.
Absolutely.
But besides that, enough about me. Let's talk about you. What makes you so passionate? Why is it that you want to represent the city?
Well, I would first start on a personal level. So I have 2 young kids. So, I mean, you always hear kind of the cliche term future generations. And I certainly feel that way. You know, I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. So I want to leave the city in a place where economically and its values are in line with where we want the future to go. And then I think from a professional level, you know, I lived in Toronto for a while and I worked actually in media such as yourself. And when I lived in Toronto, I always had this longing to come back to Edmonton. And I don't know if it's like a territorial feel, but you're proud of where you're from and you kind of believe in it. And I know politics and religion are always polarizing topics, but really, I think at the heart of every city is somebody who believes in the city. And if you have just a conversation with somebody at a coffee store or your next door neighbor, you kind of believe in its potential and you want to see it achieve its potential. So I just really believe in the city. And I guess, you know, for lack of better terms, I'm a big fan of it. And I just want to see it have a great future.
So when you're talking to your neighbors, what are the main issues that they're raising for the ward? What would be your priorities?
Oh, well, so I've already started campaigning, obviously, knocking on the doors, dropping off the flyers. What I find is it's interesting, you know, from a sociological perspective. I mean, a lot of people will always throw out the word taxes, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't really give you any concrete examples or concise examples. It's just taxes. I don't want to pay more taxes. I don't want to pay more taxes. So with those type of conversations, usually you just listen, right? Because you're not going to go in any directions. Then there's people that they'll talk to me about probably the bigger societal issues, you know, and we're obviously can talk about things like defunding the police or where we're at with obviously, you know, diversity and inclusion. And then there's people, and I kind of say it kind of like the macro versus the micro. There's the micro terms of things, right? There's people who just want to say, hey, look, I just want accessible, safe, manageable roads to drive to work every day. Or I want to be able to go to my park and ensure that, you know what, the water is going to be turned on and my kids can go through the spray park. So, I mean, from the ward perspective, I would say, first of all, probably the one issue I've heard of is roads and kind of like a distribution of equality. You know, I grew up on the south side of Edmonton, and I would say they're probably more of a have than where I'm located now as a have not. And so we want to be, you know, on the same playing field as the other side of the city. So it's just kind of that micro versus macro. You know, everybody kind of comes at you with different angles. And I wouldn't say there's this prevailing theme because, you know, a lot of people, they want to have this conversation and they go in a completely different direction.
Right. So you said that you were in the media. And so when you get elected, your job is to oversee the administration and give direction and policy guidance. What kind of work experience have you had that makes you think that you would be the best person for that job?
So certainly I've worked in media. I've worked in the public and the private sector. And, you know, the thing too is a lot of people will always say, you know, I think when we look at the political spectrum, they're going to say, you know, I really believe in the private sector. I believe in the public sector. I mean, studies usually show that the best system is kind of a combination of both, right? Where you're kind of coming within the middle of it. So I've worked for the city of Edmonton itself. I've worked in the facilities. So I'm quite aware with how, you know, everything just from scheduling works and hours and distribution of how people are paid to working with the provincial government. I worked as a paramedic. So And then I worked in Toronto and I helped launch a radio station. I worked for Sportsnet. So I guess when you said, how will I ensure that policies and guidelines, I think with all the professions that I've had, like I kind of always said, you take something from every profession that you've done and you're able to apply it to kind of where you're going and so forth. So one thing I've always thought I've been strong with is just listening and then being able to make kind of like a very educated, analytical decision making that I think specifically what the ward needs, right? I mean, a lot of people, when we think about elections, it's more on a mayor basis. I mean, they're obviously the ones that get all the headlines, but I'm very analytical based, whether it was like, breaking down sports statistics with Sportsnet or looking at, when I was on the ambulance and how quickly the ambulance is being able to attend to a patient. So, that's what I would say my strength is going forward with the
excellent.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, so you've already talked about taxes. And so let me just drill down a little bit to hear what you're hearing from your constituents. So let's deal with business taxes first. Do you feel from those who are paying business property taxes, are they telling you that they feel like their tax level is fine, that they're going to get good value for what they pay, or what are the concerns that are being raised?
Well, let me be specific. We're talking more property taxes. Yep. So in terms of business, I have, for example, I'm being endorsed by president of an insurance brokerage, and he will always say, if we're not growing, we're dying, right? So it's just kind of the common adage when it comes to business. I think most people think that they're getting value for what they believe. I mean, when you kind of maybe break down their finances, it's tough to say. But from what I've seen, I haven't seen somebody say to me, Mark, this is a huge, huge, huge issue. And to be honest with you, the majority of the businesses in my ward are a lot of mom and pop shops. I mean, there's obviously the Starbucks and so forth, but most of them are just kind of operating on a day-to-day basis, and I think that, I get the feeling that they feel that they're having successful, but there's obviously the asterisks that the pandemic occurred, and they've obviously faced a lot of shortage and obstacles over the past year.
All right. What about on the residential side? Because the city did make the decision to freeze property taxes for the first time in, I think, since 1997. Do you support that kind of approach? Do you think that we need to see property tax freezes continue on into the future, or give me your sense of how you would approach that?
Well, let me give you an example. I'm not going to name the mayor candidate, but obviously for the last year or so, people have started building their platforms, right? And they'll come out with all these huge ideas, and I think that's great. You know what I mean? So, but I saw somebody wrote on Twitter to them. They said, "That's great that you're presenting this idea, but where are you going to get this money to do this project?" And the mayor, said, "Well, in not so direct terms, they'll probably be taking the money from somewhere else, right?" And then obviously the individual on Twitter said, "Hey, well, where's that? Where's that going to come from?" The conversation stopped. Dead stop right there, right? So my idea with taxes is I think no one ever likes to pay them. I get it. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, everybody says we don't want to pay taxes, but it's like, if you really break it down, where then what are we going to do with our roads, right? Or somebody, for example, I've talked to some senior residents, that rely on the internet to go to the library and so forth, right? So I think it's a necessity. I understand, it's usually not high on people's priority lists. They just want to look at their bill and say, "Hey, this is obviously something that I'm not appreciating." But I think it is a necessity, at the end of the day.
What about the conversation about new taxation powers that comes up from time to time, especially in the context of city charter discussions? Do you think that the city needs to have more avenues to raise taxes?
For example?
Well, there was something that was called a penny tax a few years ago. It was the idea of tacking on an additional percentage point to the GST to go to the cities, or in Vancouver and in Toronto, they've got a land transfer tax so that when you sell your property, there's a portion that goes to the city in new revenues. Those are the kinds of things that have happened in other municipalities. And there have been discussions throughout the last 10 years about whether the city needs new taxation powers. So do you support any of that?
Well, I mean, you're talking specifically just to me. I mean, obviously, the values, I would have to see what the ward residents would say. I mean, for me to just say right now, hey, you know what, Danielle, yeah, that sounds great to me. I would have to obviously speak and really hear what people say. I'd probably say generally no. People would not want to support that type of idea. I mean, you can obviously knock on a door and somebody believes in a libertarian government and they're going to say, you know, the less government, the better, right? At the end of the day. So I would say from the ward perspective, I mean, the more the concern is just don't surprise me with new costs or new endeavors that I'm not really aware of. And I mean, offline, we can use, for example, the gondola. So I don't know if a lot of people know that the city of Edmonton right now has been presented with a company that wants to build a gondola across the river valley. And the overwhelming response I've heard is it's not a good idea. Now, yes, I will knock on the door and there will be the odd person who's like, you know what, yeah, I wouldn't mind a gondola, right?
So tell me why it's not a good idea, because I kind of like the idea. It seems really attractive, and it is a private sector project. So what's the opposition?
So I think, as I said too offline, as we spoke earlier, you know, you look at the riverboat, right? I remember as a little kid, I remember growing up in the city of Edmonton, and I remember Global News doing this little 5-minute montage and snippet on the riverboat. And then what exactly happened, right? They went bankrupt. The city of Edmonton had to take it over. And we're just talking about taxes, right? There's a dichotomy here, right? You say, well, you know, we support new enterprise, we support private businesses coming in and building all this, but you know, is there's this level of authenticity? Like, is this project really going to succeed, right? Like, I mean, have you heard on social media of people really saying, I want a gondola? That's what I really think the city of Edmonton needs. And don't get me wrong, right? I think part of my platform is sustainable growth, but let's put it in context right now, right? COVID-19 has just happened. Everybody's saying, you know, inflation is going to be, you know, a big factor within the next couple of years. Do we really need to focus on the gondola, or let's focus on the things that are kind of important, you know, I mean, such as, you know, transportation or our vulnerable sector. And maybe in a 5 to 10 years, maybe we could come back to the gondola. But it's just that, like I said, these type of projects, I think they're missing a level of authenticity where they think, you know what, it's going to succeed. We can present you all these numbers and information. But I mean, you don't have to go very far back with the history of Edmonton to find examples when they didn't succeed. And you know what? From kind of a pop culture perspective, a lot of people just said, hey, Simpsons monorail episode. Remember when they wanted to build the monorail? And look what happened there, right? So
all right. Let's talk a little bit more about spending, because I'm hearing you say that you think the level of taxes is reasonable and you wouldn't want to cut. But what about on the spending side? Do you think the level of spending is too high, too low, or about right?
I would probably say it's a little bit on the high side right now. I kind of look at maybe luxuries such as, I'll give you an example. What would be a good example kind of in my ward? You know, right now, I think, you know, there's always I'll look at Coronation Facility. It's a very popular recreation facility, and it always seems to be closed, right? So, which I understand. And if anybody knows about things about recreation facilities, they're heavily subsidized. They don't make a lot of money to begin with. And half of the time it's closed about 6 months out of the year. So you're kind of like talking, where's all the money going for these type of projects? And typically with that facility, I get it. They need to renovate. Maybe they need to address safety concerns. But there seems to be kind of a disconnect with what's happening with the facility and the availability of how people can use it. And so, I mean, at least if you're getting people into the facility, great. But half of the time it's closed and people can't access it. So it's just like, where's the money going? You know what I mean? And as I said, most of these facilities, they don't make money at the end of the day, but they are obviously important to a lot of people in the community. So I think it's just that balancing act, right? It's like, you know, do we really need to buy a new weight rack or renovate this part of the gym? Or can we kind of hold off on it for a while and say, you know, let's just focus more on the swimming lanes and so forth.
All right. I'm going to talk to you a bit about infrastructure projects in just a minute, but I don't want to leave the issue of spending without dealing with the big ticket item, which is wages, salaries, and benefits. Let's begin, first of all, with what city councilors pay themselves. Do you think when you look at the package, do you think it's reasonable, or do you think that it should be cut?
Well, I'm sure you saw too. I believe it was last year that they also decided not to take a living wage increase. I think they decided to vote against it. Right now, I would probably say it's a little bit on the high side. You know what I mean? So if I did get into that position, I wouldn't be looking to vote on an incremental allowance, for the next few years. So I'm, a little bit on the high side is where I would say it is.
Okay, let's go down a layer and look at the number of managers. So a city auditor report found that this middle management has grown 22%, and supervisors has increased 19% since 2017. Do you think that points to any kind of problem, or do you think that is reasonable?
Look, I've seen it from the city of Edmonton and working for the government of Alberta. There's always way too many managers. Without an unequivocal doubt, there's always way too many managers, right? And then what happens is then a new director will come in, a new executive, and what will happen is they'll have a new algorithm chart with all the positionings, and they'll say, this is how we're going to operate going forward. It's just kind of a cyclical circle, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, what we really still need is the frontline responders, right? And I mean, those are the people that, whether you're calling 311, I was wanting to record a power box that was open, and the amount of people that I had to go through just to report this power box out was ridiculous. So I always do think that, there's always a new manager or a new director who just they're trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think what we do is need to be putting that money towards the relationships of working directly with the public at the end of the day.
All right, let me talk to you a little bit about Frontline, because oftentimes collective bargaining agreements are negotiated over several years, and yet they may be mismatched with what's happening in the actual economy. So you'll have increases and people moving up the pay scale, and so automatic increases as well. Do you think that the collective bargaining process is working well, or do you think that anything needs to be done there?
Well, I don't know if you're paying a lot of attention to, but they've talked recently with the Edmonton Transit Services about privatizing some of the cleaners who are working on the bus. So I can say from firsthand experience, and they use a cleaning organization. I won't use their name, but they're reputable, and I've seen it with City of Edmonton facilities and what happens. And typically, these people that come in to clean the facilities, they're only available for very small hours, and it's maybe during less traffic times that they're being used and so forth. So I think once again, there's a balancing act with, I'm open to hearing the analytics and the reports, and you can show me as much as you want that says, if we cut frontline workers and we privatize it, I get it. You know what I mean? I'm willing to hear those studies, and I'm sure there's lots of information out there that'll present it. I'm also hearing too from people from the ward. I had just the other day a gentleman who works for ETS, and he's telling me some of the issues. So I think there's a balancing act. I'm not saying, hey, we need to privatize all frontline workers. And I'm also not saying that we should just rely solely on public workers as well. I think once again, there's a balancing act between the two.
Okay, let me ask you about infrastructure, because the Valley Line Southeast has had multiple significant delays during its construction. What's your understanding about the reason for some of those delays, and do you have any thoughts on what can be done to improve the process?
Can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, the Valley Line Southeast, it's had a bunch of delays. Do you have any understanding of what caused those delays, and if there's a different process that can be used to oversee infrastructure projects to manage them better?
So you're talking specifically about the LRT, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I would say it's also, once again, that's one of those hot topic issues that most people, you'll knock on the door and they'll always say that there's problems with the LRT, that they'll say, the projects are never finishing on time. So I guess, it's, and I'm also even going to take it into the example of Blanchford. I don't know if you know that area of the city.
I do. It's on my list. I was going to ask you about that next.
Right. So, it's one of those projects where it's like the city of Edmonton starts it, and then it seems to always be encompassed with many issues. Am I on the inside and obviously privy to the information? There always seems to be kind of a pass the buck mentality. It's, somebody's being blamed whether or not why the construction didn't happen. And I also think there's a lack of communication with what's occurring with these type of projects. I think sometimes the city of Edmonton does take on very ambitious projects and they just don't succeed. Somebody asked me, what would we do with the Northlands property there that, it's obviously Rexall's still standing there. What would we do with it, right? And I'm willing to kind of hear both sides of the argument, right? So, I mean, if Amazon was willing to come in and say, look, hey, we can turn this into, a biodiversified station with, accommodation for people to be able to get to work. Hey, I'm willing to hear that as well. But I do think sometimes the city of Edmonton does take on ambitious projects that probably don't get delivered within a timely reason. And I also think that's the nature of the beast too, right? I mean, you just have so many layers of government, you have so many city planners, then you're obviously, to a degree, you're working with private contractors to do this work and so forth. I think it's also kind of a redundant question, and that's not, any criticism to the question itself, but it's just like, these are the type of projects that will always just take time. And I understand the frustration. I get frustrated with them as well. It's just kind of the nature of the beast when you're dealing with government and so forth.
Well, let me ask then more generally about the approach of putting so much investment into LRT, because there's three other lines. We've got the Valley Line West, Metro Line Northwest, Capital Line South. Do you think that there's a better way to deliver on a public transportation plan, or do you support all of the investment in LRT?
Well, having lived in Toronto and being able to access their LRT system, it makes sense, right? But in regards to Edmonton, if you're living on the south side and you need to get to downtown, it's very, very difficult. And then obviously you take into the fact, where am I going to park my vehicle? And then obviously, how much does gas and insurance cost me and so forth. So I don't know if LRT has always been the solution to the city of Edmonton in transportation. I get it. They also talk about the city of Edmonton's idea is 15-minute neighborhoods, being able to go from neighborhood to neighborhood within 15 minutes without having to use a vehicle, right? I mean, obviously being able to walk or bike or use an alternative source. So I just don't think the city of Edmonton, and maybe when we reach that 2 million population, obviously, the numbers are always projected within 20 to 30 years, we're going to get to that population mark. Then an LRT system might make more sense, but just the sprawl of the city, it's very difficult to get from point A to point B. And for a lot of people too, a lot of the complaints are, there's very little access. I either have to take the Henday, which goes all the way around, and we obviously know the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It's just not practical. So I don't know if the LRT has always been the solution to the city of Edmonton. I'm willing to hear new solutions. Also, I'm not willing to hear about the gondola, as you already know about that. So.
Okay, so we won't be replacing an LRT strategy with a gondola strategy. I got it. Before I leave the issue of the Blatchford lands, though, the city is acting as its own developer in those cases. There is another way you could do it. You could ask the private sector to do it, but do you support having the city continue developing those lands out?
Well, I think at this stage, you've already had one mayor candidate come up with a plan for the Blanchford area. So, I mean, if people want to go to the University of Internet, they can see this mayor candidate that's already come out and talked about it. What I would say at this stage is I think there needs to be a lot more input from what residents want in the ward. It used to actually, Blanchford used to be part of the ward, but on October 18th, it's going to be going into a different ward. I think we need to hear what people want at this stage, because that's great. You know what I mean? Yeah, let's put it out to maybe some private company or real estate developer that wants to work on it. But what do the residents of that specific ward want at the end of the day? So, I'm also very skeptical when somebody just says, hey, I have my own contracts and my network of influence that'll be able to get it done. We'll see. Let's talk to the people who live in that ward and see what they would like done first.
All right. I want to talk a bit more about development issues. So everyone says they support affordable housing. So tell me, when I say affordable housing, what does that mean to you?
Well, so let's be clear. I don't know if you know, in 2010, the city of Edmonton kind of put out that, hey, you know what, everybody's going to have affordable housing and people are no longer going to be, chronically living on the street or homelessness, right? It's 2021 and the problem's even worse than it's ever been. So what it means to me, affordable housing, I obviously went right directly to the homelessness. I mean, but I can talk to a senior resident who she told me she's on a fixed income. She says, Mark, I have about $1,300 coming in a month. You know what I mean? And that needs to cover my telephone, my groceries, and everything. So it's a very encompassing discussion. I'll go back to the homelessness for this. I don't think it's the type of thing that we're going to be able to eliminate, at the end of the day. I just want us to be seeing smaller metrics, smaller percentages where we're saying, hey, look, homelessness is at this. Where are we now 3 or 4 years later? Have we improved it? Have we got more people into accessibility and where they want to live? And then, like I said, talking to that lady who's on a fixed income, it's a complex issue, right? So I would probably say affordable housing should be in line with where the rest of Canada is. Obviously we live in Alberta. I still think we're very fortunate to live here. And I still think there's a huge contingent of people that are moving towards the province, obviously away from places like BC and Ontario, but it's complex. I don't have a direct answer to it right now, but I think we need to address it on many, many levels.
All right. Let me ask you about one more aspect of affordable housing, and that's that first-time home buyer who often goes out into a suburban area, smaller lots, more density, so that they can afford to have that first-time purchase. But there's always a tension of how much do you build out in new greenfield development versus how much do you densify and build up. And I'm interested in your perspective about how you balance that.
Well, we do know that, first of all, in regards to if you, let's say, for example, we decide to build out, right? So then there might be a bit more access to green space. And we know that green space leads to higher quality of life, higher socioeconomic. There's an ecological factor that obviously correlates with your mental health. So there is an advantage to that, right? But then obviously you're talking about if we do it building upwards, with density and so forth, then obviously you're being able to build those connections from a community perspective. And you're more likely to be able to connect with people on a daily basis and kind of hear more concerns and have that availability of communication that exists outside of the cell phone. So, I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages. I get it. You know what I mean? And I would certainly support, whether a developer comes to city council and says, hey, Mark, we want to do this to this area of the ward. I get it. I think you just need to manage all the mitigating issues and see what's probably best for that area and use of land.
All right. Let me ask you about you mentioned the 15-minute community concept. As I understand it, they want everything in communities to be within kind of a 15-minute radius. So give me some idea about how your communities match up to that. Are there certain amenities that are missing, things that you would be advocating for?
Well, I'll talk a bit from the ward perspective. So from that 15-minute community, our ward, and you know what, I'm sure the city you probably interviewed, you said 25 other candidates, you know what I mean? So they're all going to say, look, I live in a very diversified ward, and I certainly feel that, obviously the closer we are to the downtown, where I'm located, it's a lot more densified, you know what I mean? There's a lot more condos, and it feels, you can even just tell from kind of a perspective of just kind of your mental aptitude, like it feels more dense. And then when I'm campaigning, when I go more north, it all of a sudden I feel like I have a lot more room and so forth. So the idea is that somebody from the very north of the ward to get to where I'm living, it's going to be tough, right? There's the transit, it's not great, but it does exist, you know what I mean? So I think 15-minute communities, I think they're there, and I think the intention of them is there. It's just how do we execute that idea? Yeah. And I think there's certainly a lack of execution that I'd probably say with what the city of Edmonton is doing right now.
All right, let's talk a bit about the economy, because everything improves when the economy is growing and new businesses are being attracted and more residents are moving in, and it increases the amount of revenue. But I think that we've had hard times across Alberta since 2014. So give me your sense of where your optimism level is at. Do you think that there is a sort of poise for growth, or do you still think that there's going to be more effort needed to attract business into the capital region?
I mean, certainly I think there's always opportunity to grow. So, but once again, I think let's put an asterisk beside it, right? I mean, a lot of the words I've heard, and and I feel the same way, is economic recovery, right? I mean, right now we're coming out of the pandemic, right? So let's kind of focus on what we need to get done, and then I would say for the next 2 years or so, and then we'll see where we're at afterwards, right? So it doesn't mean you suddenly just start, denying people, whether or not they want to open up a business in the ward. I get it, but I think it's a very buzzword word right now. I see economic recovery, and I'm just saying asterisks, you know what I mean? Like if I'm on city council, I'd like to hear a very, direct argument that, hey, let's put some spending here, or should we probably just hold back for a couple of years and say that spending will be available once we kind of balance the books, so to speak.
Well, let me tell you what others have suggested. So tax breaks are one way that you can give an incentive for a business to relocate, or a tax holiday, or streamlining regulations and permits, or direct subsidies to attract them. Does any of that appeal to you?
Oh, for sure. And in fact, I mean, before I started running for city council, I worked directly downtown. I took a drive just the other day, and you could just see for lease, right? So I totally understand that there would be an opportunity for these companies to come in, and whether it's a grant or as you said, tax incentive, I'm certainly open to those ideas without a doubt. I also heard, obviously a ward resident, we're speaking directly from the ward, a lot of those for lease property signs, maybe it could be an equivalent of helping out the homeless population, because it's obviously really gotten bad in the downtown district right now. So, I mean, there's so many opportunities with all those for lease signs. I also, though, think too, it's like, what does business mean in 2021, right? Like, do people really, are they going into buildings at the end of the day, right? Or have we had kind of this mind shift where we're now working more directly from home? And what does that mean? Obviously, then a lot of stuff's getting done online. So I'm curious what the algorithm or the future looks like with business. Like, is it really going to mean having to physically be in a building?
Yeah, well, talk to me a little bit about your interest in technology, because on your website you talk about being able to use iPhones and apps to do more city business. What do you have in mind?
Well, I would say, I remember actually a university professor said to me, and this was probably about 20 years ago, he said, this is the single most dominant piece of technology we have on a day-to-day basis. And I'm willing to bet, Danielle, that you probably look at it in the morning and you look at it before you go to bed, right? And for better or for worse, we do obviously spend too much time looking down at our cell phones. But there's some really interesting stuff going on right now with regards to how cell phones will be introduced into city planning, and how cities are working from a day-to-day basis. And I'm going to use, for example, once again, I'll go back to the homeless population right now. Look at cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, which have huge populations of people living on the street. What they've learned is that with having things such as wireless links, somebody can, for example, take a look and say, hey, I might be able to access this shelter for sleep one night. Or we've even seen that people with a lot of mental health issues, things such as reminders to take their medications or show up for appointments for to see their doctors, suddenly compliance goes right through the roof. And so I know somebody's on the other side is going to say, oh, sure, Mark, cell phones, I mean, they're expensive and blah, blah, blah. I get it. I'm not saying cell phones are going to end homelessness, but I'm saying we need to start thinking about how we're going to incorporate them. And truth be told, cell phones at this stage of 2021, they used to be seen as a luxury, right? It was a big deal when you got a cell phone. They are a necessity on how we live from day to day, right? I mean, whether it's communication or whether, you can go online and use 311 and report, hey, I got a bunch of shopping carts in my neighborhood. Can the city come and pick them? So, I mean, you can Google the plethora of studies out there that cell phones and what they're doing with cities going forward. And really, there's just more advantages than disadvantages. And I'll even just use, once again, talking to that lady in my ward, she really depends on going to the library for Wi-Fi, right? And if we have more public charging spots and more available hotspots in my ward, then they don't need to worry, hey, Sunday, I only know I can get into the library 12 to 4 to pay my bill. I can do it outside of those hours.
It's interesting too, because as you were talking, I was thinking it doesn't even have to be that expensive. If you had because we're all upgrading our phones every few years anyway. Yes, yeah. If you've got free Wi-Fi, it really just becomes a device. You can get free Wi-Fi in so many locations, so it wouldn't even have to be that expensive to try to provide that support.
Well, and I find too, the cost for most cell phones is usually the lenses and stuff. I'm just talking about, like I said, the day-to-day living for a lot of people, and how they operate. So
interesting idea. Let's. I want to continue on just asking you about a few more projects. First of all, oil and gas has been a core part of Edmonton's economy for a long time. Leduc isn't that far away, and of course, the business area in Nisku that supports the energy sector. Do you still think that there's going to be good jobs to be had in oil and gas in the future?
That's a great question. You know, I can look at two companies in the city of Edmonton. They're not based in my ward, but I don't know if you've heard of Jobber. They're starting to make a lot of moves, and they're the type of company that if you Google them, you'll see they're kind of an app that is directly based towards smaller businesses and how you do your accounting and so forth. And then I just recently saw that Bitcoin, well, whether or not you're on board with cryptocurrency, I get it. It's a very polarizing discussion, but they just leased $4 million worth of office space in the downtown core. So I look at those two companies as examples of oil and gas. I still believe that Alberta, you know, it's a big part of our economy, and I support it, and I want to see it succeed. I also don't know if those days of 2004 are ever going to exist again. I hope they do, but I certainly encouraging, you know, these companies like Jobber and Bitcoin. I want to see them succeed, and I want to see the oil and gas succeed. But I certainly think where we're going in today's world, kind of the opportunities are limitless. So we'll see.
All right, let me ask you about another part of energy, and because it was a bit of a controversial project, the idea of building a solar project on the Epcor lands in the River Valley. If you'd been elected, how would you have voted on that?
Well, I think first of all, let's put things into context as well. Right now, you could go to the city of Edmonton and with the community energy transition strategy program, they're already incentivizing people to use solar panels on their houses. And in fact, you know, if we were doing kind of a FaceTime call right now, we could walk over to a house in my neighborhood that's incorporated solar power panels on the roof of their house. So I think I would have probably. You know what? I mean, I probably would have supported the project, but then it's also, you know, I need to give you context is everything, right? Those are just my values. What does the rest of the ward feel like, right? I mean, and obviously we all want to present ourselves with integrity and character at the end of the day, but I would probably, you know, I would also say too, I'm not as educated as well as I need to be on that question. So
no problem.
Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. Let me just ask a question. You talked about the private sector, and I'm interested in knowing, because Edmonton's garbage collection is already half private. Should the city be in the business of operating golf courses, or should that be delivered privately? What's your basic take on the role of the private sector in delivering on public services?
Well, I try to ask, or like, if somebody says to me a public service, right, waste collection, I mean, then are we talking to, like, are you also referring to, let's say, policing? Are we going into that as a privatization as well? Just more reference for the question, like, which services are you referring?
Just those two. Garbage collection, it's already half private. Should be full private.
Okay.
Golf courses, should they be privatized or sold off, or continue running them with government workers?
Well, in regards to the golf, you know, I've never heard this question before, but I'd be open to it. I mean, you know, typically with that type of job, I had a colleague who used to work at a golf club, and it's very seasonal, obviously, in regards to Alberta. So I don't have too much input on privatization of golf courses. Waste reduction, yeah, you're right. It's already there too. Would I go all the way and privatize it? I mean, obviously, you're alluding to the idea of unions and how that would affect them and so forth. I think once again, I don't think it's a yes or no. I'm just going to say right now, hey, let's privatize it. I think once again, studies will show that usually a balance between the private and public sector has the most efficiency on operating.
All right. Let's talk a bit about a movement that took place over the last year. It called itself Defund the Police, but I want to know, what does that mean to you?
So first of all, I mean, let's once again put it into context. It was almost synonymous with the Black Lives Matters movement. So that type of question, it's not easy to answer, and it's probably very difficult from my perspective of who I am to give you a very good response to it. I'm sure there's other candidates who might be able to answer that question a bit better. I will take it right from Barack Obama's textbook here that he said, look, defund the police is a very, very polarizing statement, and it elicits very strong reactions from many people. He said, let's just change the semantics of the wording and go towards something like allocating the budget or something. So in terms of perspective, I don't know, you usually want to bring in probably more of those groups that we can listen to them and see what their issues are. I don't know if I'm exactly the type of individual that should be answering.
Well, if you're going to reframe it that way in talking about budget allocation, do you think the budget allocation for the police is appropriate, or do you think it should be decreased?
I don't think, well, let's put it this way, right? So I personally have worked on the front line as a paramedic, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just looking at, for example, going to a mental health call, is there the appropriate number of, for example, should we have maybe a healthcare nurse versus an extra squad car? You know what I mean? And I get it, things get tense really quickly. So it's just understanding and looking at the proper treatment and what's needed and so forth. So it's I think, when you say defund the police, once again, it's allocation, but where are we putting that money at the end of the day? Is it going more directly to, it could still be in the city budget or the city police budget, but is it somebody who has maybe is a civilian with the City of Edmonton Police, but have a background in mental health, right?
All right. Thanks for that. One more sort of policing issue that came up last year is the issue of residential speed limits being reduced down to 40 kilometers per hour. Some wanted to reduce it to 30 kilometers per hour. Do you have a thought on what you would have liked to have seen?
Well, I think in regards to speeding or, speed limits, at the end of the day, it's like, are we keeping the streets safe for kids, right? So, I mean, it takes only a split second for a child to run out onto the street. And, I'm willing to hear the argument, say, hey, I can get to work faster. Sure, that would be great, right? But I mean, I don't have a lot of, I probably don't have a lot of thoughts on increasing the speed limit, to be honest with you.
No problem. I'm looking at a picture now of the Think Tank Library downtown, and just sort of a fun little final question here. Do you love it or do you hate it? You're
talking to the new library, right?
Yep, the Think Tank Library downtown.
Okay. Do I hate it or love it? I'll probably put it this way. From an architectural standpoint, I love the inside of it. It's very postmodern, very different levels to it. And I've been there a couple times myself, and I see some of the work that they're doing with the people that are accessing it. You know what? I would say at the end of the day, it helped promote what little is left in our downtown core, and that's not a bad thing.
All right. Now, just a couple of final questions about how you see your role as an elected council member. There is going to be a referendum in conjunction with the municipal election. It's on equalization. It's a provincial issue. Some municipalities are having municipal referendum on local issues. Generally speaking, do you support that kind of direct democracy, or do you prefer to make the decisions yourself as an elected representative?
Well, it's an interesting question, because one of the things I always hear the people will say, Mark, what party are you with, right? They'll say, they'll come door to door, and they'll, obviously you're now talking about a provincial or federal level, and you're saying it's going to trickle down to the municipal level. Would I support a referendum going forward in a discussion on it? That's a tough issue. I think there's a slippery slope once we start doing that. And I mean, you could look at something, for example, the mask issue. I don't know if you saw the vote this past weekend, but it was 7-6, right? And I'm just going to once again go back to something like, you could use social media, or you could see just sound bites or quotes from the newspapers. One person is going to say, hey, I supported it, and the next person is going to say, we're not protecting our kids. We should still continue to be masked. So those are the type of questions that it's like, if we start going down that path, what does that mean for city politics? I sometimes think we do think too advancedly. Let's also just focus on what city politics are, and leave it to the provincial and federal level as well. you're never going to make everybody happy, right? I think, as you said, context is everything. You said at the offline at the beginning of this interview, this is more catered to one side of the political spectrum, and I understand that, right? So it's finding that common ground and having that discussion at the end of the day.
Well, I mean, I hope you feel like I'm asking you fair questions. Do you think, is there something I've missed that you wanted before I ask my final question? Something else that you feel like I've not asked you that you wanted me to?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think I think actually we hit all the topics. So absolutely.
Beautiful. Let me just ask you one final one then. There'll be certain circumstances where the administration will want to recommend something that they tell you is best for the city as a whole, but your constituents may want you to vote the other way. What would you do in those circumstances?
Well, I think all you can do is you listen, you have as much education as you can, and once again, you stand by your integrity and character. I think somebody had said recently, you're not going to make everybody happy in politics, right? I mean, at the end of the day, everybody thinks, that they need to one up one another with a comment or a blog or something like that. I mean, you just take as much information as you can and you make an educated decision. And I mean, if the constituents are saying, hey, Mark, we don't agree with this, then obviously, yeah, I would support the constituents at the end of the day. I mean, it's that balancing act, right? It's that macro versus micro level. I get it. If I'm on city council, we need to do what's great for the city, but I'm also advocating for the ward at the end of the day. So there's no easy solution. I'd probably typically, though, at the end of my whole campaign is a lot of it's predicated on advocating for the ward. So, but I also want to see the city grow, and I also want to see it do well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the conversation. I appreciate your time today.
For sure. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you in the future.
You got it. That's Mark Davies. He is your candidate for Ward 2, Anirniq.